So I've done a lot of experimenting with the DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro with time lapses. And I've tried a bunch of manual settings, a bunch of automatic settings. I've tried ND filters, no ND filters, etc. And in this video today, I'm going to share the settings that I have found work best to get the best, highest quality time lapses from the Osmo Action 5 Pro. One aspect of the Action 5 Pro that really helps with time-lapse quality is that higher megapixel sensor. It really makes a big difference in time-lapse quality compared to the Osmo Action 3 and 4. Some of the time lapses I've been able to capture with this camera have really surprised me. In the past, I considered the GoPro the best with clarity and detail, but what I always liked about the Osmo Action cameras is I liked the color science for time lapses. I often thought those time lapses looked better with the colors than those from the GoPro. So really quick, before we get into the best settings, a couple things you'll want to have for capturing time lapses with the Osmo Action 5 Pro is you'll want to first of all have a tripod. Now the tripod does not need to be anything fancy. There's a tripod from Ulanzi that I often use that can also be extended as a selfie stick. Basically, you just want to make sure you have a tripod so that your Osmo Action 5 doesn't move while you're time lapsing. The second thing I recommend is having a power bank right here. If you're going to be time lapsing for any longer than 2 or 3 hours, you'll want to have that power bank. Otherwise, your Action 5 Pro is going to run out of battery. This one right here from Anker is my favorite, and it will power your Action 5 Pro even with the battery removed. I have tested it out and it works great with that as well. And then the third thing I recommend if you want to get the very best time lapses with the Action 5 Pro is I do recommend a pack of ND filters. These ones right here from Freewell are my favorites for the Action 5 Pro. I use these often while capturing time lapses. And the reason these are beneficial is you can pop these on and you're going to get a slower shutter speed with your time lapse because these limit how much light hits the sensor. And when it's really bright out, your Action 5 Pro has to adjust to a fast shutter speed. And a fast shutter speed has very sharp frames. The frames don't have as much of that smooth flow to them with a time lapse as when you have on an ND filter, because with an ND filter on, you can get a much slower shutter speed and it'll look a lot better. So I'll link to these 3 accessories in the description below. But at the end of the day, the only accessory that's really essential to have is a tripod of some kind, because you don't want your camera moving while it's capturing a time lapse. So let's delve into those settings, and I'm going to show you the settings that have worked to get me the very best time lapses. First thing we'll want to do is we'll want to power on the Osmo Action 5 Pro, and then you want to make sure you're in time lapse mode. You can get there by either swiping left or right on the main screen. And once you get to time lapse mode, you want to swipe up from the bottom, and you want to select time lapse right here and custom down here. But you also want to make sure you're in 4K 30 up here or 4K 25, depending on what country you live in. And then up here, I recommend doing screen off. That way it's going to save some of your battery. That means the screen will go off during the time lapse. It's not going to be keeping it on the whole time, draining it. And then this is really a preference, standard D-warp or wide. If you're doing a landscape, I highly recommend doing wide. If you're doing something where you absolutely don't want any fisheye effect, you can do standard D-warp. But it is going to introduce quite a bit of a crop, so I like to keep it at wide. And then once you've set those settings right there, and you've made sure you're at time-lapse and custom, you want to swipe up from the bottom. And it's time to set our interval parameter. So if you're doing a time-lapse during the day, which this is about, if you want to learn about my night-lapse best settings, I've linked to a video above that will show you those. But these are just for daytime, sunset, and sunrise time-lapses. If you're doing a time-lapse over a couple hours, I recommend the 2 to 5 second interval. If you're doing a sunset, I recommend the 2 to 3 seconds so you capture all of those details at the peak of the sunset or sunrise. But if you are doing an all-day time-lapse, you may even want to do more than 5 seconds, something like 10. The interval is really up to you, but do keep in mind the further apart your interval is, the shorter your resulting time-lapse will be. So I'm going to put this to 5 seconds here. And then for the video duration, I recommend selecting infinity. That way you can start and stop your time lapse whenever you want to. But this is a handy tool if you want to calculate how long your resulting time lapse will be. So say you put the duration to 2 hours, that means you'll have your Action 5 Pro out there capturing the time lapse for 2 hours. With 2 hours at a 5 second interval, your finished product time lapse is going to be 48 seconds. If you put that interval down to 3 seconds, your finished product is going to be 1 minute and 20 seconds. If you put the total duration to 5 hours and put it to 5 seconds, you're going to have a total time-lapse length of 2 minutes. And then if you bump the interval up to 10 seconds, you'll have a time-lapse length of 1 minute at a 5-hour duration. So if you want to calculate that, I definitely recommend playing around with this. It makes it super easy to calculate right inside the camera. I'm going to go back to 5 seconds and infinity, because those are the settings that I generally work with. And then after you've set those, we can go back to the main screen here, and we're going to click on the advanced parameters over here. And first of all, for the exposure, I tested out a lot of different combinations here, including a manual one. And what I found is with the improvements on the Action 5 Pro, I do keep this at auto most of the time, but there are a couple settings I change while having it at auto. So the first thing I do is I put the ISO range from 100 to 800, and then over here for the EV values, I put this to negative 0.3. The reason I put it to that is if I'm doing a time lapse that involves clouds, having the EV value set slightly below 0 helps preserve a lot of those details in the highlights, and the time lapse ends up looking a lot better. This is really important during the day or at sunrise or sunset. And then after setting those, what you want to take note of, especially if you're using ND filters, is you want to note what the ISO is defaulting to. So right now I'm indoors, so the ISO is boosting all the way up to 800, and the shutter speed is 1/40. Now, if I was outside and I had a shutter speed of 1/40, that would be phenomenal. But on a bright day, the only way I would be able to accomplish that would be putting an ND filter on. In this particular pack, we have ND8, ND16, ND32, and ND64. And this particular pack also has the polarizing effect, which is really nice because on a bright sunny day, it's going to eliminate some of that glare. And you're going to get those rich colors and details with these, so I really like that about them. So if it was a bright sunny day outside and you're going to use ND filters, I would start with ND16. That's generally the best one to start with. And after you pop it on, there's one thing you want to check. So as you'll notice right away, before I put on the ND filter, my shutter speed was 1/40. Now after putting it on, my shutter speed is 1/4. So you can see ND16 really slowed that down a lot. So ideally what you want is you want the lowest ISO. You want the ISO as close to 100 as possible, while also having the slowest shutter speed. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to put on too dark of an ND filter such that it boosts your ISO all the way up to the max end of that range. What I have found is with an ND filter on a bright sunny day, I've found generally ND16 or ND32 is going to get me a shutter speed of about 1/120. And then it's going to give me an ISO generally about 300 or 400, which is perfectly fine. There's not going to be any noise or grain at those levels, and you're still going to get the advantage of a slower shutter speed. So you definitely want to play around with it, but if you put on an ND filter and the ISO is at the very upper end of the range, that means you can go to a lower ND filter, like an ND8 in this case. But if you put on an ND filter and the shutter speed is really fast, let's say the shutter speed is 1/480 or faster, then I recommend putting on a stronger ND filter. In this case, ND32 would be stronger. You just want to find the happy medium there with the shutter speed. I like getting the shutter speed slower than 1/200. It's going to give the smoothest, best results. Anything slower than that. So shutter speed of 1/120, 160, all of those are great. But then I also like to keep the ISO not at 800. I like to have the ISO around 300 or 400 or lower for best results. But if you're not using an ND filter, don't worry about that. These settings right here, they're going to get you great results. You're just going to have a little bit faster shutter speed, so your motion's not going to be quite as smooth in your time lapse. So after you've set those, you want to click confirm down here. And then for the white balance, I highly recommend setting a static white balance. If you are doing a time lapse during the day, you'll want to do 5600K. That's going to give you really good results. If you're doing a sunrise or sunset time lapse, you want to do 6500K. Those colors right there are going to be great. And you're not going to have your white balance changing during the time lapse, so that's going to make it look extra good as well. And then finally, the format down here, you've got a couple options. And what I love about the DJI Osmo Action cameras is you can do both video and photo at the same time. When you're using some competing action cameras, you have to pick one or the other, but the Action 5 Pro will let you do both at the same time. but you do need to make sure you have a fast enough micro SD card. So in my Osmo Action 5 Pro, I run the SanDisk Extreme Pro micro SD card. I find the Pro is needed when doing a time lapse with the photo and the video. Otherwise, it's usually going to give an error message saying your micro SD card cannot keep up. But my favorite combination to do here is the video plus RAW. That way I have the raw photos later on that I can edit and get even better results than the video. But if you know you absolutely don't want the photos, you can just do video here, and you're just going to get a single .mp4 file that's ready to share directly from your Action 5 Pro camera. But if you are doing photos, I don't recommend doing video plus JPEG, because JPEG is not really going to be able to be edited. It's going to have pretty much all of the details baked into the file. So I recommend video plus RAW. That way I have both later on to choose from. And once you've keyed in those settings, you are good to go. And your Action 5 Pro is ready to capture some incredible time lapses. And speaking of the DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro, if you'd like to learn more about this camera and how to get the very best results in a variety of use cases, check out this playlist right here.